Good to be here. Always good to be here. Currently in Galway, in Ireland. But a few days ago, I was in Rotterdam, in the Netherlands. That's a city that I go to at least once a year. And that's because I'm usually invited to the International Film Festival in Rotterdam, where I do many interviews with lots of different guests of the festival for Fred Film Radio. But this year I was only invited for 3 nights and I really didn't feel like going. But I did go in the end because I promised myself that I would try to take some time out to finally explore some of the city's museums and possibly encounter some artworks to talk about in this new series that I've started on my YouTube channel, Matt's Wuthering Art. But I was disappointed to find that while I was there, many of the museums, well, the main museum in the city was closed, possibly for renovations. I still haven't figured that out. And the other museums that I went to were pretty disappointing for one reason or another. So I was a little disheartened, and as I walked about Rotterdam, I was like, all right, well, I wasn't very lucky this time around. But again, as I walked around it, I realized that Rotterdam really has some of the most exciting architecture I've ever seen. And I thought that maybe I could just dedicate a video to architecture. I mean, obviously, the simple fact is that you don't only encounter great art in museums, far from it. There may be a wonderful piece of work of art outside of your own home and you don't even know it. But certainly, Rotterdam, as I said, has one of the most exciting architecture that I've ever seen. And the reason is that during the Second World War, and specifically in May 14, 1940, it was basically bombed to the ground by the Germans that relentlessly just bombed and destroyed most of the city. And after the war, the people of Rotterdam, instead of rebuilding it as it was, or trying to rebuild it as it was, they decided to build it and make it better. So they just built these new buildings, and many of them distanced themselves from the traditional style of Dutch architecture. In fact, the city sort of became a patchwork of styles of modernist architecture from the 60s, 70s and 80s. And to this day, it maintains a sort of a unique visual and aesthetic identity that is really, really cool. I think the most famous of these new buildings are, well, unquestionably, the block houses. Now, these are houses that are also referred to as cube houses or tree houses. They are known by a couple of different names, and I think that for the majority of this video, I will refer to them as block houses because it's just the coolest, I think, term to call them. Anyways, these houses are near the Black Underground Station and close to the old mouth of the River Rotta, or, I suppose I could refer to it as the Old Harbour. In fact, it's a whole entire housing estate that was designed by architect Piet Blom, who was born in 1934, trained as a carpenter, later obviously became an architect, and developed this really cool concept for living as an urban roof. Very briefly, this concept had 2 major objectives. The first one I hinted at earlier, which was to distance itself from the monotony of post-war Dutch architecture. And the second one was to encourage a more active communication between the living spheres, or you could call them the private spheres. Actually, that would be better. A more active communication between the private sphere and the public sphere. In other words, the living sphere and the housing spheres. So in fact, the block houses, which may be briefly described as tilted blocks that appear to be held up by tree-like trunks, are housing or living spaces at the top and commercial spaces at the bottom. And on the inside, the windows ingeniously manage to give inhabitants a clear view of the environment and the surrounding space through some of the windows. In fact, the windows of these houses tend to offer viewpoints that are quite unusual and different from the windows, I suppose, of the vast majorities of houses around the world. But anyways, let's put a time frame to this blocky housing complex, shall we? The drafts for their original design were first made by Blom in 1973, but it took almost a decade for constructions to begin in Rotterdam. And the construction's actually stalled for a couple of years due to financing problems. And they were only completed 2 years later in... well, they were only completed in 1984, I think, because the works themselves actually began in 1982. And when they were completed, two other adjacent noteworthy complexes were built. One of them is the Spanish Quay and the other one is the Black Tower, and the latter is actually known by its pencil-like shape. But for time's sake, I'm not going to stop and talk about those two. I'm going to focus on the housing complex itself. From a municipal towns planner's perspective, this housing complex actually also offers a bridge between the housing project and Rotterdam's Old Harbour and the inner city. So it's like a safe crossing over a busy traffic of the Black Artery, which is a busy road down which many cars and bikes go. So it was also done for safety, but actually Piet Blom says he was inspired in his design of this housing estate/bridging housing complex by the Ponte Vecchio in Florence, Italy. But there is also a more theatrical and visual concept behind its modern dramatic architecture. Blom, in fact, says he envisioned a type of oasis, of a safe oasis, which explains the tree-like structure of the houses themselves. In fact, the housing complex is commonly referred to as the Black Forest. And if you happen to walk through it, it really does, as strange as it sounds, feel like you're walking through a forest. And that's especially true if you look up and you see the sun kind of shining through the houses. Although there's no branches, it almost really does feel as if you were walking through some sort of a modern forest. Anyways, by the way, this year I decided to visit one of the houses on the inside for the very first time in 6 years to get an idea of what they're like. And what it is that there's a sunroof at the top and living spaces on the 2 floors, on the bottom 2 floors. And usually it's a kitchen at the bottom and bedrooms on the 2nd floor. I think that, well, yeah, the design certainly does favor aesthetics over functionality, and you can kind of guess that from just looking at them on the outside. But they are still surprisingly easy to live in, and they retain a trendy look about them. I mean, they're really, really cool. Well, the stairs are quite steep, and the rooms tend to be quite narrow. So mobility is a problem, but I guess that anyone who makes the conscious decision to live in a building such as this has no bad legs or bets they will never have such problems in their old age. So, but they're really cool, and I can see myself living in one of them. Only I think it's quite expensive to live in them. Well, that was my first Wuthering art dedicated to architecture. I hope I did a good job, because it's, I think, the first time that I dedicate an entire video or even talk about an architectural work in such detail. Obviously this is quite a superficial overview of the block houses, but the point of these videos isn't to get into too much detail, because the devil's in the detail, and we don't want to make the devil angry, right? Who wants to make the devil angry? Alright, I hope you'll join me next time on another artistic venture, or venture into the art world. Ciao.